Et les malheurs du Gaulle du Racing allaient trouver chez Albert Camus l'indulgence d'un confrère.
Dites-moi, le Gaulle du Racing n'a pas l'air dans une excellente forme.
Oh, il ne faut pas l'accabler. C'est quand on est au milieu des bois qu'on s'aperçoit que c'est difficile.
Vous avez joué Gaulle, je crois.
Oui, j'étais Gaulle au Racing universitaire algérois qui portait d'ailleurs les couleurs du Racing Club de Paris.
Mais le Racing est terriblement dangereux en fin de mi-temps. Alberto, Caelbel sont à l'ouvrage. Voici Caelbel aux prises avec Bamana. Il ne sait que faire. Bamana renvoie un peu en retrait. Dalacieca toujours lui reprend. Revient un petit peu en arrière.
Un but partout et rien ne se passera jusqu'à la mi-temps. Laissons Alberto à ses brillantes interventions et posons à Albert Camus la question qui se pose dans toutes les pensées.
Quelles sont, selon vous, les raisons qui ont déterminé le choix du jury?
Bien, je ne sais pas, parce que je ne suis pas dans le secret de l'Académie suédoise, mais je pense d'ailleurs sincèrement qu'il y a 2 ou 3 écrivains au moins qui méritaient d'être choisis avant moi. Mais puisqu'ils avaient décidé de nommer un écrivain français, peut-être ont-ils voulu montrer que la France avait un visage parfois plus jeune qu'on ne le pense généralement.
Dans toutes les circonstances de sa vie, obscures ou provisoirement célèbres, jeté dans les fers de la tyrannie ou libre pour un temps de s'exprimer, l'écrivain peut retrouver le sentiment d'une communauté vivante qui le justifiera, à la seule condition qu'il accepte, autant qu'il peut, les 2 charges qui font la grandeur de son métier, le service de la vérité et celui de la liberté.
Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, was a French philosopher, author, and journalist. He is often associated with existentialism, though he himself rejected the label and instead considered his works to align more closely with the philosophy of absurdism. Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, at the age of 44, making him the second youngest recipient in history at that time. His works are recognized for their deep insights into the human condition and are widely studied and celebrated both in the literary and philosophical contexts. Camus was born in a small coastal town in Algeria, which was then a French colony. He was raised in a poor family and grew up in the diverse working-class neighborhoods of Algiers. His father died in World War I when Camus was just an infant, leaving him to be raised by his mother, who was partially deaf, in a household that valued hard work over intellectual pursuits. Despite this, Camus showed promise in school and was encouraged by a teacher to pursue his studies. He attended the University of Algiers, where he studied philosophy. During this time, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that affected his health throughout his life and contributed to his sense of the fragility and absurdity of existence. Despite these challenges, Camus was a dedicated student and was heavily influenced by his readings of Nietzsche, Gide, and other philosophical works. Camus' philosophy of the absurd can be summarized as the conflict between our desire for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. As he famously opens his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. For Camus, the absurd arises from the confrontation between the human need for understanding and the unreasonable silence of the world. One of Camus' most famous works is The Stranger, L'étranger, published in 1942. This novel tells the story of Meursault, an emotionally detached French Algerian who kills an Arab man and is subsequently put on trial. Rather than being judged for his crime, Meursault is judged for his seeming lack of moral character, particularly his inability to display proper emotion following his mother's death. The Stranger is often interpreted as an exploration of the absurdity and alienation inherent in human existence. Another of Camus' major works, The Plague, La Peste, published in 1947, is set in the Algerian city of Oran, which has been struck by a devastating plague. The novel can be read both as a vivid account of human responses to disaster and as an allegory of the Nazi occupation of France during World War II, which Camus had lived through and resisted as a member of the French resistance. Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, is often cited as a key exploration of his philosophy of the absurd. In this work, Camus uses the Greek myth of Sisyphus, a king condemned by the gods to eternally roll a rock up a hill, only to have it roll back down, as a metaphor for human existence. Camus' Sisyphus, however, embraces his task and thus creates his own meaning, defying the gods and the absurdity of his situation. This, Camus argues, is how we must live, creating our own meaning in spite of the absurdity of life. Camus also made significant contributions as a playwright. Caligula, The Misunderstanding, The State of Siege, The Just Assassins, and as a journalist and essayist, The Rebel, Resistance, Rebellion, and Death. In his political views, Camus was consistently anti-totalitarian and deeply committed to individual freedom and justice. He was briefly a member of the Communist Party in his youth, but he became disillusioned with communism, and his experience during World War II solidified his stance as a political liberal who championed individual rights. Albert Camus died in a car accident in 1960 at the age of 46, an event that shocked the world and left many feeling that one of the great literary and philosophical voices of the era had been silenced too soon. Despite his relatively short life, Camus' works have left an indelible mark on literature and philosophy. His explorations of the absurd, his passionate defense of individual freedom, and his deep humanity and commitment to justice continue to resonate with people around the world today. Albert Camus' relationship with Algeria was complex and deeply influential on both his life and his work. Born on November 7, 1913 in Mondovi, a small town in French Algeria, Camus grew up in a colonized land that was culturally and geographically distinct from mainland France. His experiences in Algeria, where he lived for the majority of his formative years, were instrumental in shaping his worldviews, his sense of identity, and his philosophical and literary themes. Camus was born to a French Pied Noir family, a term used to refer to French people living in Algeria during the period of French rule. His father died when he was an infant, leaving Camus to be raised by his mother in a working-class district of Algiers, the capital. Growing up in a poor household, Camus was familiar with the hardships faced by the lower classes in Algeria. Camus' experiences growing up in Algeria are apparent in his writings. Many of his literary works, including The Stranger, The Plague, and his lyrical essays in The Myth of Sisyphus, feature Algerian settings and vividly evoke the country's landscape and atmosphere. His debut novel, The Stranger, for instance, is set in French Algeria and begins with the famous line, "Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure," translated from French. The novel's protagonist, Meursault, is a French Algerian who shares many biographical details with Camus. Camus had a complex political relationship with Algeria. Throughout his life, he was caught between his identification with the Pied Noir and his recognition of the injustices inflicted upon the indigenous Arab and Berber populations by French colonization. In his journalism and essays, Camus often criticized the social and economic conditions under which both the European Pied Noir and indigenous Algerians lived, and he was a vocal critic of the administrative and social segregation in Algeria. However, his stance on the Algerian War of Independence, which raged from 1954 to 1962 and sought to end French colonial rule, was controversial. Camus advocated for a civil truce that would spare the civilians on both sides, rather than full independence for Algeria. He hoped for a future in which French and Arab Algerians could coexist under a reformed, more equitable political system. This stance made him a target of criticism from both sides. The French right saw him as a traitor, while the left, including many of his intellectual peers in Paris, viewed him as insufficiently supportive of the independence movement. For Camus, Algeria was home. He once declared his deep bond with the Algerian landscape, stating that he was inspired by my love for this country, to which I owe all that I am. After he moved to France, he often expressed a sense of longing for Algeria and its landscapes, and he returned several times during his life. His early death in 1960 meant that he did not live to see Algeria gain independence in 1962. Camus' nuanced and sometimes contradictory stance toward Algeria has been a topic of extensive scholarly discussion. His unwillingness to endorse the National Liberation Front, FLN, and its armed struggle for Algerian independence disappointed many of his contemporaries, including Jean-Paul Sartre, and has complicated his legacy. However, some modern scholars and readers view Camus as a prescient voice for the kind of multicultural understanding that might have offered an alternative to the violent and divisive path that the Algerian War ultimately took. His humanist principles and his deep attachment to Algeria are seen as driving his desire for a peaceful solution to the conflict. In summary, Albert Camus' relationship with Algeria was deeply entwined with his personal, literary, and philosophical life. He is often read as a writer of exile and of the tension between identities, which is reflected in the nuanced, complex stances he took on issues related to his homeland.